Hello, everyone, and welcome today to Phoenix Gaming. I am Nick Henning, your host. I'm here to just do a quick video to talk about some Frosthaven strategy, or really more Frosthaven math, just so you have a sense of how things go. This is the same as every Haven game, so no difference between Frosthaven and the others. It's just the one that's on the menu right now. And I want to talk about how long you have in a given scenario based on your starting hand size, and then based on how many lost cards you used. I got the idea of this video when I was doing the review of the Drifter recently, and talking about, starting with 12 cards and using some sort of persistent lost cards. There are different kinds of lost cards, right? The lost card that you put into play and that then sticks around for the remainder of the scenario, giving you some bonus. And then there are lost cards that just kind of do one big whammy momentous kind of attack in the moment. And that is basically it. However, in terms of your longevity in your stamina, how long you can last in a given scenario, how many rounds you have to play out the scenario, they actually end up operating the same. A magic number in Frosthaven for a lot of scenarios ends up being around 12. 12 is kind of the rounds for a handful of the shorter scenarios where maybe you just need to live to the 12th round, or something happens on the 12th round. I think a good number of scenarios in Frosthaven roughly last from maybe 18 to 20 rounds. And so you're trying to think about playing through the scenarios in a way that you can get through those 18 to 20 rounds. And that's a really, really rough number. They're not all designed that way. It depends on the way you're gonna play through the scenario, but if you're paying attention to how many rounds you're going through, and you'll kind of be able to sense it by how many cards you have left at the end of the scenario and how many cards you've used as your losses. So let's just start off and dive into what this looks like. So you can see on the left side here that if I am playing a character with 10 starting cards, which is what I would consider to kind of be the base fundamental structure. 10 is kind of like the default number of cards I think most characters bring into scenarios with them. You will have 25 total rounds if you never once use a lost card. Here's how that breaks down. My very first run through, I call them cycles often, but what I've said here is rest 0. I'll have all 10 cards in hand. If I play 2 cards, and then 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 play 2 cards, 5 times I was able to play 2 cards, and then I go into a rest cycle. So while I have 10 cards, I have 5 action rounds that I can take. And then when you rest, you lose a card. So I go down to 9 cards when I am looking at after having rested the one time. That means that with 9 cards, I can really only take 4 turns. And after that, 4 turns, after that, 3 turns, 3 turns, 2 turns, 2 turns, 1 turn, and 1 turn. And if you've played this game any number of times, you of course know kind of what that cycle looks like, but you maybe have never sat down and actually really counted out what those turns look like in cycle to you. So if I go through and I never use a lost card, I am going to be able to play this scenario for 25 rounds, which for almost every single scenario is going to be more than you really need to get through it. In some scenarios, it's going to be double the length of what you need to get through it. But this, of course, is assuming that you've used no lost cards and that you haven't lost any cards due to taking damage. One of the things in Frosthaven or any of the Haven games is you should never exhaust from damage. Really what damage does is it burns your cards until you're no longer able to use cards lost. So I wanted to take a look and see and show you what happens if you use a lost card in your first cycle. Your number of rounds drops by 4 for the scenario. If I used 2 lost cards in the first cycle, my number of rounds drops by 8 from 25 down to 17. Sorry, you can hear my cat screaming in the background. The reason that this essentially happens, the math that it basically comes down to here, is every single time you use a lost card, it skips you to the next spot in this row. So with 10, you go 5, 4, 4, 3, 3, 2, 2, 1, 1. If I use 1 lost card in the first cycle, it's going to knock out this second row. It's going to delete this second row. Now, here's the clever thing, and you probably know this sort of intuitively, but if you use your lost cards, you can use both lost cards, but if you use a lost card in the very last round, well, it doesn't change anything because you were already going to pass out anyway. But this logic actually applies sort of even earlier. Let's say I'm down to 5 cards and I use a lost card. Well, I in total have run for 23 rounds in this scenario. So using a lost card later in the scenario in this situation came at half the loss of total rounds of stamina compared to when I used it in the very first round. So when we're talking about lost cards, when you use them makes a big difference. A lot of folks don't want to, end up using a lost card when they're down to 4 cards, because what it does is it means it's going to knock out the next row. It's going to knock out a round. However, it's very salient to you that you're going to lose the game essentially right after this, right? If you have 4 cards and you use a lost card, when you go to rest, you're only going to have 2 cards left and then you're done. So folks are very reluctant when they're down to 4 cards to use a lost card. But the reality is that it's only cost you the 1 round. If for some reason you are very, particularly spendthrift with your lost cards earlier on, you used one earlier, it actually ends up costing you more in terms of your stamina. So you've probably already played with this intuition of I should use my lost cards at the end. And that holds completely true. Essentially the round you use it, however many cards you would have in the following cycle, the following rest cycle, is how many action rounds you are going to lose for that lost card. Okay. I think this kind of thinking is very, very helpful to understand what it is that you are giving up over the course of the entire scenario. Now, let's look at, I've been talking about the Drifter was my sort of baseline of thinking about it. If I'm playing the Drifter, I can last for 12, or I've got 12 starting cards. I can last for 36 rounds compared to the 25 of a character that is a 10-card character. And if I'm the Drifter and I decide to put 2 persistent abilities in play in the first lap, I've dropped myself down to 26 rounds. And that is basically the same as a 10-card class. And intuitively, this makes sense to us, right? We've got 12 cards. We've used 2 lost cards. That drops us from 12 down to 10. And so a lot of times when I see those 11, 12-card characters, you know that I'm almost certainly looking at a character who is going to be using lost cards to kind of maintain the length of the scenario. A pretty goofy character certainly is the Geminate, which starts with their 14 cards. And it's not as simple as saying they have 14 cards, because they have 7 and 7 of their 2 different forms, and they really need to manage it kind of perfectly to go all the way down to the end. But imagine that you did manage to play the Geminate perfectly in terms of like switching between your modes. Hey, sweetheart, you're very cryy right now. Between your different modes, you could go for 49 rounds, which is completely unnecessary. But there's a lot of lost cards that are built into the Geminate deck, and this is a class that can be, I think, a little bit more liberal with using lost cards to prevent damage. So you can see sort of the impact of lost cards on these characters. Let's look at an 11-round character. 11-round character lasts for 30 rounds. If you're going to use a lost card in the very first round, drops you down to 25 because it's just knocking down the 5 of this right here. But if you waited for a little bit, maybe into the middle here, only going to knock you down those couple of rounds. So you will have just about as long a reach as a 10 card class if you use it at the beginning. And by the beginning, I don't mean like the first round, the very first turn of the game. I mean in the first cycle before you take a rest. Now you'll notice here I haven't talked about short versus long resting. In terms of your ability to impact the game, nothing there changes. Long resting is its video all on its own about whether you should or shouldn't long rest. But the short version is that long resting is always beneficial as long as it doesn't cost you anything in the tempo of the short rest, right? Like if there's monsters that are going to pummel on you, then long resting is bad, of course. But if you're perfectly safe, if you're able to play this game in a bubble, if we're just playing in a white room where we spawn monsters at our will, long resting is always the choice that you should make. That's just because you get additional healing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It doesn't change the number of rounds that we can kind of impact the game in. It might change how long your character lives synchronously with other characters at the table, but it doesn't change the number of rounds that you get to impact the game in, which I guess is really what I should be saying here when I'm talking about total rounds. That is the number that we're looking at. So when we're thinking about this, we want to consider, especially earlier in the game, what we're giving up. We are giving up some rounds of actions in exchange for a lost card. That means that lost card needs to do something that is superior to rounds of action. Suppose that I'm talking about right here at the end, I've got 4 cards left and I use a lost card there. What I've given up there is 1 round of action. Actually, at that point, I know exactly what round probably I'm giving up at that stage, right? Like what action options I have in those final 2 rounds of the game. I'm removing one of them. I'm only going to have 1 round after this. And so the question comes down to, does using this lost card now do more than having that extra round along the way? If your cards aren't beneficial in terms of like essentially you're just doing a move 2, attack 2 or something like that, something very basic, then that lost card might make the huge difference there. The other thing to think about, because it really doesn't come down to how many actions you have over the course of the game, it's kind of what is happening in the moment. You might need to complete a certain objective. There's a lot of objective-based things in Frosthaven, or you might be getting a certain reward, or for a fact that you are about to win this scenario and your character is going to exhaust, and that's okay because your friends are actually about to make it to the end. There's a lot of things that you can consider in there, and all would be completely reasonable. The other thing that I think is really beneficial in considering use of lost cards, particularly earlier in the lap here, like suppose you're in cycle 2 here and you're thinking, should I use one of my lost cards? Well, if a card is going to prevent you from getting hit in such a way that you will then need to use a card to prevent the damage, it's going to make the difference there. You'd much rather use your lost card for its impact if it prevents the enemy from attacking you and making you lose a lost card. So that trade-off of, is the damage they're going to do to me exchange for a card that I'm going to lose? And the way that I think you can get a sense of that is how often, are you losing cards in a given scenario? Are you losing 1 card per scenario? That's maybe reasonable. If you're losing, I think 3 or 4, something is going wrong, and I would implore you to investigate your other strategies. But if you're losing 1 card per scenario on average, then how much damage are you taking when you're losing that card? Do you lose that card when you're taking damage to put you down? Do you lose that card when you're taking 5, 6, or 7, or 8 damage? What's your cutoff where you're going to make that decision? And if you start getting a sense of those things, then preemptively you can say, okay, well, I wasn't planning on using this as a lost card this time, but if I do, it'll kill that guy or disarm that guy or stun that guy, and he's about to do an attack 5 on me. So if I would later in the scenario lose a card to prevent an attack 5, then maybe I should just use my lost card right now, kind of circumvent that whole thing. So that's the kind of things I think that you should be considering when you are using your lost card. As a very last thing here that I wanted to do just as a thought experiment, in the Haven games, you are playing 2 cards per round. But what if you had some cool ability that allowed you to just constantly pick up a card from your discard pile? In the original Frosthaven, suppose you had a stamina potion that you could use repeatedly over and over and over again. So I also took a moment to look at what would it look like if you were only using essentially 1 card per turn instead of 2 cards per turn in terms of your longevity. And if you were a class starting off with only 8 cards and you used 1 card per turn, you'd last for 28 rounds, pretty much the same as a 10-card class. If you're a 10-card class and you only used 1 card per turn, you're talking about lasting for 44 rounds, Geminate level here, which I think is part of the reason why that 3 Spears class in Gloomhaven created some buzz historically. So you can see how sort of like recovering cards persistently, or recovering 1 card persistently, can add to your longevity here. But before you kind of like look at that and start drooling, realize that when we are talking about normal classes with normal card recovery abilities, if you have a stamina potion that lets you get 1 card back from your discard pile, essentially all that really does is, in the right laps, adds an extra round of actions. And what do I mean by the right laps? Well, suppose that I'm a 10 starting card class. If I use a pick up a card from my discard pile, it actually doesn't do anything for me. I'll still have only 5 action rounds because I play 2, play 2, play 2, play 2, and then I have nothing left in hand. So you want to be really cautious that you're using those stamina potions or those recovery abilities are much more ideal when your starting cards for the scenario are odd. If you have an odd number of cards in your hand on a given cycle, then suddenly that recovery ability means that you're going to have another action round in that given cycle. And that's pretty much it for us today, folks. I hope that was interesting and helpful for you. Let me know in the comments that this is how you think about timing, or if this has kind of changed the ways you're thinking about timing. Apologize again for the little one over here. I'm going to go play with her, but why don't the rest of you have a wonderful day.